Welcome, everybody, to a new edition of UFO Live. And with my friend Tommy Highway.
Hey, folks, this is Tommy Highway. I want to thank everybody for coming out. As always, folks, we have a very special guest for you this evening. His name is Stephen Boucher. He's from St. Catharines, Ontario, and he has a very interesting story to tell. You've actually probably already seen him on networks like the History Channel, Project Veritas, Giant FM, The Grant Cameron Show. And Stephen is a musician, author, a fine artist, and an alien abduction experiencer. And he was also, very interestingly enough, personally regressed by none other than Mr. Budd Hopkins himself. Folks, it is our honor and my pleasure to bring you Mr. Stephen Boucher. Stephen, welcome to the program.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Our pleasure.
All right, Steve. Tonight we're going to tell your story. So before we do that, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Well, let's see. I worked as an AutoCAD draftsman for a number of companies. I've been married twice. Don't have any children, and I'm an abductee.
You're also a fine artist, right?
Yeah. I have some pretty good art pieces, and I have a website at www.experiencer.ca, and that's where I have samples of some of my artwork and my music, and some pictures that I had taken at the Alien Cosmic Expo in Toronto, where I met people like Richard Dolan and Paul Hellyer and Linda Moulton Howe and Travis Walton and a few other people. So it's been an interesting journey.
Very cool. Tommy?
That's absolutely outstanding. Again, I was telling you backstage that I actually saw you tell your story once before. It was on the History Channel, and it's just very intriguing, and you tell it so well. And I guess basically, should we talk about the band abduction experience? Is that would that be okay?
Yeah, we can start with that one if you want.
That'd be great.
That was probably back around 1971 or 72. Where I was in a band called Harmony Grove, That's my band there. We changed our bass player. He's the guy in the top row in the middle there. That's the new bass player. So he wasn't with us when this happened. But anyway, we had played in Niagara-on-the-Lake at a place called the American Hotel. And we were the house band there for about a year or so. And one night after we finished playing, we were packing up our stuff, and the drummer said that he had been invited to a party in Jordan. And he said they were hoping we could maybe play a set. And he said, "Are you guys still up to going, or are you too tired?" And we agreed we'd go and play one set. So we drove off to Jordan to this house. It was at a house party, and we played a set there. And there was a guy there that nobody knew. And I'll call him Alex. But he was just a young guy like the rest of us that was sitting there, and he seemed like he'd had a few drinks. He was half in the bag, and he asked if we could give him a lift back to St. Catharines. So we decided to do that, and he climbed in the van with us. There was the guitarist. I'll call him Tom. He was the driver. And next to him was the drummer, which I'll call Sam. And then in the back, there was myself, the guitarist's girlfriend, the bass player, and this hitchhiker, Alex, and all the equipment. So we were packed pretty full. We're sitting on the equipment and driving back to St. Catharines. And we went to get onto the QEW highway to go to St. Catharines, and we found that the entrance to the highway was closed. So we decided to take the service road down to the next junction and get on it there. So we took the north service road, and we were driving along, and we were talking and just enjoying ourselves and enjoying the ride. And then all of a sudden we noticed the van was stopping. So I said to the guitarist, "Why are we stopping?" And he said, "Well, you guys better take a look at this, because you aren't going to believe me." So I looked over the seat. We were all kind of looking over the seat, and we could see parked in the middle of the road. Well, it was actually sort of a parking lot for this restaurant that was on the North Service Road. And the road ran parallel to the southern shore of Lake Ontario. And in that parking lot, we saw a large saucer-shaped object just sitting there. And it appeared to have red lights around the outermost perimeter. It was sitting on what looked like tripod legs of some sort. I'd say it was about maybe 50 feet in diameter, 40 to 50 feet in diameter, and it had portholes above the lights, recessed portholes. And we could see this thing from a distance, and the guitarist said, "What do you think it is?" And so we were trying to come up with some sort of a rational explanation for it. And I said, "Well, maybe it's a prop. Maybe they're making a movie there, and this is a movie prop." And the drummer said, "Well, I don't think so." He said, "Why would they be shooting a movie at, by now it was about 3 a.m. or so." And so we were sort of wondering what to do about it, because it was right in the direction we were heading. So we made the decision to turn around and go back, and we'd take the back roads home instead. And so we started to move forward, and I was expecting the van to turn, and nothing was happening. And we were heading for this thing. And I said to the guitarist, why are we heading toward the thing? I thought we were going to turn around and go back through the back roads. And he said, well, I'm trying. And he said, look. And I looked at his hands, and he had the wheel cranked over all the way, and nothing was happening. It wasn't turning. And I said, well, put on the brake. And he said, I'm trying. And I looked at his feet, and I could see he was pumping the brake, and nothing was happening. And we were heading straight for this thing, and we were going at a pretty good speed. And I didn't know what was going to happen. I noticed that there were no bumps in the road. We were just kind of floating smoothly, and I couldn't feel the normal bumps in the road that you'd feel when you're driving. And so we were heading toward this thing fairly quick, and I actually was bracing for impact because I wasn't sure if we were going to hit it. I didn't know what was going on. We were all panicking in the van, and everybody was yelling and talking all at once. And when we got up to about maybe 20 or 30 feet away from the thing, the van came to rest in the road, and the engine was off. It wouldn't start or anything. So we were just sitting there, and everybody was yelling, and the drummer turned around, and he became the voice of reason at that point. And he said, everybody just shut up. And so we all went quiet at that point. And he said, I don't know what this thing is, but he said, if we all sit here in the van and we don't make any noise, and we keep completely quiet and try to stay out of sight, he says, maybe they'll leave us alone. And so that's what we did. And we didn't have any other plan. And so we just sat in the back of the van, and everybody was very scared. We could feel like a real heavy tension in the van. And then I heard the drummer, that I'll call Sam, he said, oh no. And I said, what's going on? And he said, they're coming out. And I said, oh, I got to see. And he said, no, stay down. He said, stay down, don't move, keep quiet. And so we had all the doors locked, and we could, I said, well, what do they look like? And he said, they're just little guys. And I said, little guys? And he said, yeah. And we could feel them trying the door, like we could hear them trying to get the doors open. And there was only one side window in the van. It was kind of like a cargo van. And there was a big picture window in the side of it. And I saw this head go by the window, and it surprised me so much. I said, did you see that? And everybody went, shh, you're quiet, be quiet. And I said, yeah, but did you see that? And Anne-Marie, the guitarist's girlfriend, said, yes, I saw it. And so the hitchhiker, he was kind of drunk, and he was just sitting there in the corner in the back of the van, and all of a sudden he started looking around at us, and then he just, for some reason, he reached over and he grabbed the handle of the back door and pulled on it and opened the door. The door flung open, and there was at least three gray beings standing there in a lineup in the parking lot, looking in at us. And the one that was in the front was the one that I called the leader, and I called him Rigel. And he was a gray with a large head and large black eyes that kind of curved up the side of their head. So when he went by the window, I was looking at the side of his head, but I guess their peripheral vision is greater than ours, because I could see that eye curving up the side of his head, and I knew he was looking in the van just to kind of check out the situation, see how many people were in there, and you know. But when the hitchhiker opened the back door, he came in. He just I don't know if he climbed in or what, but he just kind of floated in through the back door, and he was standing there in the van, in the middle of the van, and his head was clearing the ceiling by maybe about 3 or 4 inches. So that give you an idea of the height of these guys, you know. And he started looking at us, and he said, I realized at that point I couldn't move. I had reached for the mic stand because I wasn't sure if we were going to get into a confrontation with them. I might need something to defend myself. I didn't know what was going on, and I couldn't move. And he said, I'm sorry that we had to temporarily paralyze you because you were thinking thoughts of violence, and I was concerned about the welfare of my crew and myself. And he said, I don't mean to harm you. We're not going to hurt you. We just would like 3 people to come on board the ship with us, and we want to run some tests, and then we'll get you back to your van, and you can be on your way. And at that point, I could hear him inside my head. He was speaking telepathically, and it was very quiet in the van at that point. And I noticed when I looked at his eyes, I could hear him more clearly. So he started to pick 3 people, and he picked the hitchhiker, he picked the bass player, and he picked myself. And when he looked at me, I looked at the floor of the van. I didn't want to look at his eyes. And he waited for a few seconds until I finally couldn't stand the pressure anymore. And I looked up at him, and as soon as I looked at his eyes, I heard, "And you," in my head. And he said, "Would you follow me, please?" And at that point, he turned around, he started to walk toward move toward the back of the van, and his foot got caught in the snare drum stand, and the snare drum fell over, and it rolled out of the back of the van, and one of the other beings picked it up immediately, and he looked at it, and he was looking it over, and then when I got out, he said, "Is this yours?" And I said, "No." And when I realized at that point I was face to face with him, just not even a couple of feet away. And I heard this thought in my head was, "Oh my God, are you ever ugly?" And at that point, he turned his head away and looked away from me. He didn't want to look at me so I wasn't sure if that was me thinking that about him or him thinking that about me. So anyway, he handed the drum to the leader, and the leader asked me if it was mine. I said no, and he said, "Who does it belong to?" And I said, "It belongs to him." And I pointed to the drummer in the passenger seat, and he gave me an awful look, like he wished that I hadn't pointed to him. And so anyway, the leader said to the other being, "Go and get him." So he went around to the passenger side of the van, and he came back with the drummer. And the leader handed the drum to the drummer, and he said, "Is this yours?" And he said, "Yes, it's mine." He said, Is it okay? And he looked it over quickly and he said, yeah, it's fine. And he laid it on the floor of the van. And at that point, the drummer became one of us as well. So now there were 4 people. So the only people that really remained in the van were the driver, who was the guitarist, Tom, and his girlfriend, Anne Marie. And the other 4 of us, we followed the leader, and he led us around to the side of the van, and he said, I want you to line up along the side of the van. So we did that, and he said, now we're going on the ship. And he said, I want you to turn to your left, and you'll be facing the back of the person in front of you. So we all turned to our left. And he said, I'm going to go in front and lead us, and the others will go in behind you. And he said, there's 2 things I have to tell you. He said, when we go on the ship, he said, when we start to move, we're going to go on as one unit. And he said, don't turn to the left or the right. Just keep facing the back of the person in front of you. And when we go up onto the ship, he said, don't touch the hull. Well, I was a pretty disobedient little guy at that time. And I couldn't resist it. I turned my head to the left for a minute. And as soon as I looked to the left, we stopped. And when I faced ahead again, we'd all move together. And we weren't walking, we were floating. And as one unit. And then I said, oh, that's how it works. And I turned to the right and we stopped again. So I just wanted to confirm. And when I turned forward again, we went up into the van. We made a 90-degree angle to the doorway of the ship. And it was an arched doorway. There were steps, but we didn't use the steps. We just kind of floated. And so I disobeyed him, and I reached down and I just touched the hull of the ship for a couple of seconds with my ring finger on my left hand. And it felt warm, and it felt metallic. And I noticed that there seemed to be divots in the hull, like spot welds or something. And after I touched it like that, about 2 weeks later, I developed this horrendous blister on my ring finger. Or not a blister, a wart. And it took ages to get rid of it. It took me weeks to get rid of this thing. It covered the whole pad of my finger. So anyway, when we were going up into the ship, the leader was in the front. Then there was the drummer, and I was behind the drummer. And I was looking at, he was wearing a black leather jacket. It was cold. It was, sometime in winter. And he banged his head going in the arched doorway. Because it wasn't really made for big, tall guys like him, and it was made for these little guys. And as soon as he bashed his head on the top of the entrance, the leader turned around and he said, oh, are you okay? And he said, yes, I'm all right. But he was rubbing his head, and you could see he wasn't happy about the situation. So once we got inside, it wasn't really bright in there. It was kind of dimly lit. And as soon as we got in there, they separated us from each other. So there was like one being for each member of the band. And since I had been talking to the leader, I got him. And he was standing there talking to me in the ship. And I could see the curvature of the ship, and there were benches. that followed the curvature of the ship. And he brought me over to one of these benches, and he said to me, you need to remove your garments and put them in a pile on the floor. And he said, nobody's going to take them. You'll be able to see them from where you are. But we just have to have you remove your garments for the tests. And I had also brought my bag of recorders with me. The recorders, they look like this. This is an alto. But I had a tenor in there, and I had a soprano, and I had brought the bag. It was a burlap bag, and he said, just put that on top of your clothes. And I didn't want to leave it behind in the van. I wanted to bring them with me. So he said, I looked over and I noticed that the hitchhiker, he was removing his clothes, and I noticed that he had long underwear on, and it was cold. It was like winter or approaching winter. And so he, after I removed my clothes, I said, can I keep my underwear? And he looked at me and he said, what is underwear? And so I pulled on the strap and I showed him, and he said, yes, you can keep that on. And so he took us over to, he took me over to another part of the ship. And the drummer did not want to cooperate. He was standing there by the entrance, arguing with one of the Greys that was trying to get him to remove his clothes. And he said, no, I am not going to do that. And I could hear him arguing with this Grey being. And the being said to him, well, he argued for a little while. And then he said, well, will you at least stay here and wait for the others until we finish the test? And he said, yes, I'll do that. So he stood there with the Grey that was with him. And I'm assuming the others went with the being that was with them. And I couldn't see them anymore because I went around to this other side of the ship. And there was a countertop there. And he asked me to get up on the countertop and sit there and wait. So he said, we're going to get the equipment ready to do the examination. And so I was sitting there on the countertop in my underwear, and I was thinking, I've got to get something. If I can get something from the ship to prove that I've been here, because nobody's going to believe me when I tell them this. So I reached down, and all I could feel was a knob on one of the doors. And so I wondered to myself, I wonder if this would unscrew. So I started turning it with my hand, and I felt it getting looser. So I was pulling on it and turning it, and I finally got it off. And the leader was talking to another being, and he had a metallic tray standing up, and on top of the tray there was a towel with some instruments in it, and he was unrolling the towel, and I could see these instruments that looked like surgical instruments or dental instruments or something. And so I was holding on to this knob, and I didn't know where to put it. I didn't have any pockets. And I thought, well, can I stash it in my armpit, or should I just hold on to it? And at that point, the leader turned around, he came back, and he said, we're ready to do the test now. And he said, what have you got? And I said, what do you mean? And he said, you took something. And I realized that at that point that you can't hide anything from these guys. They know your thoughts. And even if you try to hide something, the guilt must show up. Somehow they know. And so I opened my hand and I showed him. And he picked the knob up out of my hand And he started looking at it, and he said, "You can't keep this." And the other being that was standing by the tray said, "Why not let him keep it? What harm can it do?" And he looked at the other being, and he said, "We can't let them keep anything. We're not supposed to let them keep anything." And so the other being just didn't say anything. And the leader took the knob and he put it out of my reach somewhere. And then he brought this metal, what looked like a gurney over. And I think it had like a thin mattress on it. And he said, "I need you to shift over onto the gurney, or onto this platform." So I shifted my body weight onto it, and I was sitting on the gurney. I don't know if it had wheels, but it was movable. And he was pushing it, and he pushed me over to this area of the ship where, when I looked up, I could see that there was something on the ceiling that looked like lights, but they were in the form of concentric circles, or they may have been like in a helix shape. But anyway, the being with the instruments came over, and he said he had an instrument on the tray that looked like, at the time I called it, it looked like a handheld unit from a contemporary phone. It was kind of a rectangular. And the leader picked this off the tray, and he said, "I'm going to show you how this works." And he held out his arm, and he switched something on this box, and it shone like a green light on his arm. And where he was shining it on his arm, I could see the skeletal structure of his arm. And I thought, it's some kind of a X-ray device or something. So he said, "Now I want to try it on you." And he said, "Would you hold out your arm, please?" And I said, "Well, is it going to hurt?" And he said, "No, but you may feel a little bit of a tingling sensation." So I held out my arm, and he shone this green light on my arm. And I was really surprised, because not only could I see my skeleton under the skin, but I could see the muscles, I could see the veins and the arteries, and I could even see my heartbeat pulsing in the veins. And so I was really surprised to see this, and I could feel this tingling sensation. And he said to me, "Now we'd like to use this device to look inside your body." And he said, would you lay back on the cot or whatever?" And I said, "Okay." So about 3 beings surrounded me as I was laying on this cot, and they were using this device to look inside my stomach and at my internal organs. And I seem to remember that there may have been like a screen on the wall that showed a bigger version of what they were seeing. I can't say that for sure, but I seem to remember that. And so anyway, I don't know what they found, but they found something. And he said to me, "Okay," he said, "what I want you to do is look up at this light on the ceiling." And I looked up at these concentric lights. And at that point, it started to spin. And it must have been helical or something, because it was spinning and dragging my vision toward the center of it. And I was staring at this thing, and I felt my eyes starting to get tired. And I stopped looking at it, and I looked back at the leader, and I said, "I don't want to look at that thing." And he said, "No, it's very important that you look at it." look right into the center of it. He said, it's extremely important. So I looked back at the thing, and I was essentially being hypnotized. I called it the hypnodisc. And so I blacked out at one point, and I don't know how long I was out for. But when I came to, they were rolling up the towel with the instruments in it. And he said, we're all finished. He said, I'll take you back to your clothes and you can get dressed. So he wheeled me back to the bench where my clothes were on the floor. And I noticed that the other guys were there getting dressed as well. So they must have undergone a similar procedure. And so as I was getting dressed, he said, we have a couple of minutes now that if you have any questions, we can answer your questions. And so they started at the other end, and one of the guys asked, where are you from? And he showed us a star map on the wall. And he said, do you know anything about the stars? And we said, well, not really. And he said, well, then you probably it won't mean much to you. He said, but we're from this area here. And from my memory, I suspect that he was pointing to around Orion, the constellation of Orion. And he said, what else? And the other guy asked, have you got any bases on Earth? And he said, yes, actually there's one right out here. And he pointed out through the porthole toward Lake Ontario. And all the while these guys were trying to come up with questions, I was thinking, he probably gets those questions all the time. So I'm going to ask him something a little more profound and see what he says. So when he came to me, I said, what is the true religion on Earth? And he it seemed to take him aback a bit, and he looked at the other being and like with a puzzled look on his face. And then he looked at me and he said, why would you ask a question like that? And I said, well, because you guys are obviously a lot more technologically advanced than we are, and you're probably more socially advanced than we are, and probably more spiritually advanced. So if anyone would know what the true religion on Earth would be, it would be you guys. And he seemed kind of puzzled at my question. And he said, there is no true religion on Earth. And then he said, and that's the end of the questions. We have to go now. And so I said, well, wait a minute. I said, you can't just leave me hanging like that. Like, what do you mean there's no true religion on Earth? And he said, I'm sorry, but the questions are over. He says, we probably told you too much already. And he said, so it's time to go back to your vehicle. So the other guys went ahead of me. I was the last one to go down the steps, and I was still puzzled about his answer. And just as I was about to follow them down the steps, he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, wait a minute. He said, I want to talk to you a little more. So the other guys left the ship, and I was standing there, and I blacked out again. And when I came to, I was standing on the pavement in the parking lot, looking at the ship, and I could see the leader that I call Rigel was standing in the doorway of the ship, and he was kind of silhouetted with the light in the background behind him. And it was dark and it was cold, and I could see these two black eyes staring at me. And he was telling me something, but not to my conscious mind. He was telling me right into my my subconscious. And what it felt like was when you have a really good dream and you're waking up and you're trying to remember the dream and it's slipping away and you're just grasping at it, trying to remember. I was trying to remember what he was telling me. And I felt this tremendous feeling of love coming from him. And it was like an unconditional love that I never felt from anybody in my life before. And because it was cold and that my face was itching. And so I reached up to scratch my cheeks and I found out they were soaking wet. And I thought, I've been crying. What did he tell me that made me cry like that? And I was very emotional. And I was standing there holding my bag of recorders. The others had all gone back to the van. And he came down from the doorway of the ship and he came right up to me and he said, wasn't there something you wanted to show me? And I think what he was trying to do was divert my attention so that I wouldn't be trying to remember what it was that he told me. And I said, what? And he said, there was something you wanted to show me. And then I realized that it was my recorders. And so I said, oh, yeah. And I opened the bag and I took one of them out and assembled it. They were in pieces. And so I played a little bit on it to show him how it sounds. And then I handed it to him. And he took it and he looked at it and he kind of studied it. And he put it up to his face and I thought he was going to blow into it. And then he did something really strange at that point. He put it up to his nostrils and he blew into it through his nostrils. And he got a couple of sounds out of it, you know. And I was wondering, why did he do that? And before I forget, a couple of, well, some years later, when the Canadian UFO Research Network researched my case, they showed me a document about an alien autopsy where Leonard Stringfield was present during this autopsy, and he wrote what was happening. And he wrote in that document that the Greys don't have, they have one organ that does the job of the heart and the liver and the kidneys, I think it was. And he said they don't have a digestive tract like we do. The mouth is just a pocket that goes to the neck and it stops. And I suppose they kind of regard it the way we regard our appendix, you know. And it's just a pocket. They don't digest their food the way we do. And when he said that, he said they only breathe through the nose. And when I read that in the document, that was when I realized why he put the recorder up to his nose instead of his mouth. And it all started to make sense. But anyway, going back to the parking lot, I took another recorder out of my bag. It was a little soprano recorder, and it was made of a substance like bakelite. And I handed it to him, and I said, would you like to keep this as a souvenir? And he said, what is a souvenir? He didn't understand the word. So there's two words he didn't understand: underwear and souvenir. And when I explained that it's a gift to remember me by, he said, yes, that would be fine. So I handed the recorder to him, and he pulled it from my hand. I kept a little bit of pressure on it because I wanted to see if I could feel him pull it out of my hand, so I'd know that he was a non-corporeal being. And he pulled it out of my hand, and he took it and he put it onto his belt, and it just stuck there. And I thought, well, that's odd because it's made of bakelite. There's no metal in that. How is it that he's getting it to stick to his belt like that? And then I started thinking, I like that little recorder. I hope I can go back to the music store and buy another one. I hope they still carry them. And immediately he took off his belt and he held it out to me and he said, "Would you like it back?" And I said, no, you keep it. I want you to keep it. And he said, "You're sure?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Okay." And he put it back on his belt. And I realized that he could read my thoughts. He knew exactly what I was thinking the whole time. And so he said, "Would you like me to take you back to your vehicle?" And I said, "No, that's okay. I can go back." And I said, "Am I going to see you again?" And he said, "Oh, yes, you'll definitely see me again." So I walked back to the van, and the back doors of the van were open. And when I approached it, I could see all the members of the band inside, and they were all like they were in suspended animation. They weren't moving. And as soon as I climbed into the van, they all came to life and started moving again. And the drummer said to me, "We've been discussing this incident and we've all agreed on something, and we need you to agree to it as well." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "We are not going to tell anybody about this." And I said, "What do you mean we're not going to tell anybody?" I said, people should know that this stuff happens. And he said, "No." He said, we're all in agreement. We're not going to talk about this or tell anybody about it." And he said to me, "If you say anything, if you tell anybody, we're all going to deny it and you'll just look like an idiot." So I was really upset that he took that position because I really wanted people to know about it. And I noticed that the hitchhiker was no longer there. And I didn't know what happened to him. And I was kind of concerned about it because it was winter, it was cold, and it was a long way from there to St. Catharines to walk. And I was worried about what happened to him. So we started the van, we started going back to St. Catharines, and the whole time I could hear these beings in my head telling me that I was going to forget this incident. And I was having a mental argument with them, telling them, "No, I am not going to forget this, and you can't make me forget it. I will not forget this." And all the way home, they were telling me this: "You'll forget, you're going to forget this." And we watched the ship. When we started the van, we watched the ship, and it moved out toward Lake Ontario, and it got smaller and smaller and smaller and at that point, it had a white glow around it, and it became like a very small white light in the distance over Lake Ontario. So they drove me home, and when I got home, my parents were already sleeping. I had a key, so I let myself in. I made a sandwich, and I got a pencil and a pad of paper, and I wrote down in point form everything that I could remember about that incident. And so once I wrote all this down, I tore the paper off the pad, I put it in the top drawer of my dresser, and I went to bed and I fell asleep. And so the next day, I go in that top drawer of my dresser a lot, and the paper was not there. And I had successfully forgotten the incident. I guess they must have worked on me most of the night while I was sleeping, and they made me forget. So it wasn't until several years later that I remembered this incident. I've been under hypnosis at least a dozen times. When I went to, well, I'll just kind of give you a bit of a prehistory about how this all came about. I had read a book by Budd Hopkins called Missing Time. And when I read this book, yeah, very good book. It had a very big impact on my life. And after I finished reading it, I was getting sparks of memory that were coming back to me while I was reading it. And at the end of the book, there was a paragraph where Budd had written that if any of you believe that you have had experiences similar to the ones mentioned in this book, you can contact me at this address. And he said, we'll put you in touch with someone who can research your case. And so I was thinking of writing to him, but I had also had another incident, an earlier incident with my dad when I was 4 years old. And during that incident, my dad was abducted, and I was sitting in the car and waiting while he was being abducted. And one of the beings was sitting in the car next to me, or in the car with me at the where my dad would sit at the driver's seat. And so I started to remember pieces of that incident. And I thought, well, I'm going to ask my dad about this. And if he remembers any of this, that will be confirmation to me that it wasn't a dream. And I'll write to Budd Hopkins and see if he can put me in touch with somebody who can investigate it. So that's what happened. I went out and I sat down next to my dad, and I asked him, I said, there's something I got to ask you. I said, do you remember when I was about 4 years old, we were coming back from somewhere, I'm not sure where, and I said, I don't know if it was in St. Catharines or if it was in Owen Sound. We lived in Owen Sound for a little while. And I said, we were driving along a dirt road, and the cars back in those days, they had a shelf behind the back seat. And I was just 4 years old, and I used to climb up on that shelf and lay down on it, and I'd look up through the back window at the stars. And so that's what I did that night. And I saw this light in the sky that was following us, and it was getting closer and closer and bigger and bigger. And I felt like it was communicating with me, like it was speaking to me or something. And I got very curious about it. So I got down from the shelf and I climbed over into the front seat next to my dad. And by this time, it was traveling at treetop level, matching our speed on the left side of the road. And I said to my dad, what's that light out there? And he said, what light? And I said, that light. And I pointed to it, and he looked through the driver's window. And when he saw this thing, it was like he went into an instant panic, and he started speeding up to try to outrun it. But you can't outrun these guys. And I said, what is it? And he said, shut up, leave me alone. And I could hear the tension in his voice, like he never used to talk to me like that. And so the thing shot ahead, and it came down in the road ahead of us. and it lit up the whole road and the trees and everything beside us. And my dad had to stop. He couldn't go any further because it was right in our path. And then he managed to somehow regain his composure. And he looked at me and he said, I'm going to go out and see what they want. And he said, you stay here in the car. Don't get out by any means. Don't get out. You stay here in the car and stay low so they don't see you. And he said, I'll be back. And he got out and he started walking. There was two beings in the road by that time in front of the car. And he walked up to the one being and he started talking to him. And the other being just kind of stood there like a guard. He didn't do anything. And I was very curious. I was looking over the dashboard and I could see them in the road there. And somehow I felt like I knew these people. And so I was wondering what my dad was doing, and I was curious about who these beings were, and I couldn't overcome my curiosity. You can get away with a lot when you're only 4. So I got out through the driver's door, and I started walking up toward my dad, talking to the being, and he positioned himself in the front of that being so that he couldn't see me. And he could hear me coming, and he put his hand behind his back and he made like a motion like that to get back. And I just walked up beside him, and the being suddenly looked around my dad's shoulder and he said, you seem concerned about the child. And my dad kind of laughed sheepishly and he said, yeah, that's my boy. And then once he realized the being had seen me, he turned to me and he said, I told you to stay in the car. Go back and get in the car and stay there and wait for me. And I said, but I want to see. And he said, go back to the car. And the being that my dad was talking to, I believe that it was the same leader that was present in most of the incidents that had happened to me, the one that I called Rigel. And so Rigel looked at my dad and he said, would you like my crew, the closest word I can come up with is crew member, to take him back to the car for you, to your vehicle? And my dad said, no, that's okay. He said, we have to get going. My wife's waiting for me at home, and she's going to wonder where we are. And immediately, the other being that was standing there to his right came over to me and took me by the hand and walked me back to the car. And my dad was just standing there in the middle of the road, kind of dumbfounded, and I could see this look on his face like he wasn't happy about this at all. And I got in the car, and the being got in next to me, and he kind of closed the door. And at that point, the other being, the leader, took my dad, must have taken him inside the ship because they were no longer in the road. And so I was sitting in the car with this gray being sitting there next to me in the driver's seat. And I don't know if you can see this. It's kind of a model that I made of what I felt they looked like. So anyway,
wow.
And so my dad had gone on board the ship, and the being that was sitting in the driver's seat, he held onto the steering wheel and he looked at me and he said, what does this do? And I said, well, that makes the car go that way or this way, depending on which way you turn it. And he said, oh, I see. And then he pointed to the pedals on the floor and he said, what do these do? And I said, well, that one makes the car go, and this one makes it stop. And he said, oh, okay. And he said, can we start the car? And I said, no. And he said, why not? And I said, well, you need the key for the ignition, and my dad has it. He said, oh, I see. And then he said, he pointed to the radio, and he said, what does this do? And I said, well, that's a radio. I said, we can hear music on it, and we can hear people talking. And he said, oh, he said, are you able to talk back to them on it? And I said, no, you can only listen. He said, oh, I see. And so he said, what do you do during the day? Do you go to school? And I said, no, I'll be starting school next year. So that's how I knew that I was about 4 years old, because I started school at 5 in kindergarten. And so he kept me amused for quite a while. Basically, he was babysitting me while my dad was being abducted. And so I talked to him for a while, and then I saw my dad come back out with the other being, and the one that was with me said, I have to go now. And I said, well, can't you stay a little bit longer? Because I was actually enjoying his company, because he was talking to me and he was taking an interest in me. And when you're that age, most adults don't pay a lot of attention to you, you know. And so he was kind of keeping me amused. And he said, well, maybe I can stay for a minute. And then I looked and I saw the other being nod his head like that. And then he said to me, I have to go now. And he got out and he started walking toward the other being. He passed my dad in the road coming back to the car. My dad got in the car and he shut the door. And he was sitting there and he was very quiet. And we watched the two beings get on the ship, and the ship lifted off the road and started back over the trees where I had seen it before. And my dad started the car, and we started driving down the road. And my dad, when I asked him if he remembered these things, he remembered everything up to that point. What he didn't remember was that they returned. They came back a second time, and they came down in the road and stopped us once more. And my dad was sitting there, and the being came over to his window and motioned to lower the window. And in those days, we didn't have electronic windows. We had a crank. And so he cranked the window down a bit, and he said, what is it? And I could hear him under his breath. When the being was standing outside, he was going, oh, what the hell do they want now? And so anyway, when he rolled down the window, the being said, you forgot this. And he handed him his eyeglasses. And my dad said, oh, thank you. And he took the glasses and put them on. I guess he'd taken them off on the ship and left them there for some reason. Forgot about them. And they brought them back. They're very concerned about any equipment that we have, like anything that we possess, the drum or glasses or whatever it was. They want to make sure that we come back with everything we left with. So anyway, we watched them leave again the second time, and then we drove home. So when my dad confirmed that he remembered putting his hand behind his back and going like that, and he remembered getting mad at me for getting out of the car. When he remembered all this stuff, it confirmed what I remembered. And so I wrote to Budd Hopkins. And a little while later, I don't know, maybe a week or so, he called the house and he got my mother on the phone. And he said, your son wrote a letter to me he said, I feel that him and his father may have had a UFO abduction, and that's what I do. He says, I work on abduction cases, and I was wondering if there's some way that they could come to Manhattan for a week. Do they have any holidays coming up? And so she told me, Budd Hopkins is on the phone. I almost fell off the bed and in my room, and I came running out and got on the phone, and he asked me if my dad and I could come to Manhattan. And I asked my dad, and he said, no, I can't leave my job. He says, I have to work. But me, I had a week holiday or vacation time coming up, and I was going to use it to go to Owen Sound to visit my best friend there in Owen Sound. But when he said, can you come to Manhattan? I said, well, how will I get there? And he said, well, you can take the Sky Bus. And he said, either myself or my friend will meet you at the airport and bring you to my art studio. And he said, it's a fully furnished apartment as well as an art studio. And he said, you can stay there for a week or so. And he said, I'll make arrangements for some hypnosis sessions for you with Dr. Aphrodite Clamar. She's the hypnotist that worked on all the cases in his book, Missing Time. And he said, I'll also make an appointment with a behavioral therapist because we want to rule out that you might be crazy. And so we need a behavioral therapist to examine you and determine that. And so I said, okay, I'll go. And so I took the Sky Bus and I went to Manhattan. And when I got there, there was a tall blonde-haired guy standing there holding a sign that said Budd Hopkins on it. And I knew that must be my contact. And I walked up to him and I said, I'm Steve Boucher. I'm supposed to meet with Budd. And he said, yeah. He said, my name's Ted Blocher. And he said, I'm going to take you to Budd's art studio and I'll give you a key so you can come and go. And he said, we've got a couple of sessions, 3 sessions of hypnosis lined up for you, and a session with this behavioral therapist. So I said, okay. And he took me to Budd's art studio in Manhattan. He gave me a key and he said, when you go in, he said, keep the door locked at all times. You know, even if you're only going out for a second, keep the door locked. So I said, okay. And so I went there and I stayed for a week. And I went for 2 of the sessions, which were recorded by Dr. Clamar on cassette. And the 3rd session, she was sick, but Budd had a key to her facility, and she told him that he could use her office to do the session himself. So she had confidence in his ability to perform hypnosis. So he did the 3rd session himself. The first 2 she did, and we recorded them. But the 3rd session, unfortunately, that Budd did, the microphone wasn't placed properly or something, and it was just a muddled noise. We couldn't get any information from it. So when I came back to St. Catharines, I transcribed the first 2 tapes, and I've included that the transcriptions, in my book. So the actual word for word transcriptions are in my book. Yeah, it's called called Beyond the Extraterrestrial Firewall, an Experiencer's Point of View. And Grant Cameron did the foreword for me, because he was the one that encouraged me to write a book about my experiences. He'd been trying to get me to do it for a while. So it's available in paperback on Amazon, and also as an ebook on Kindle.
Outstanding.
We have a couple questions for you, Steve, that we got to address. One was, have you received any implants during all this time?
Well, when they did that medical procedure on me during the incident with my band, I call it the van incident, they may have either put one in or taken one out. I don't know what they did, because I was out through the whole procedure, and I didn't wake up until they were wrapping up the instruments. So they may have done something with an implant at that point. But I also had an even earlier incident when I was about 2 years old, and I believe they put an implant in me then.
Okay.
Well,
go ahead, Tommy.
If I may, Steve,
Yeah.
did you suffer any ill effects from the procedure, whatever procedure it was that they put you through? Any sickness, any soreness, anything? Did you notice anything strange about your body afterward?
Nothing that I noticed except the wart on my finger, and I think that was my own fault for disobeying them. So now, if I ever have another encounter and they ask me not to touch something, I'm going to leave it alone, because that was very hard to get rid of.
The other question I got for you, Steve, is this. Occam's Razor in the chat asked, when you were on board the ship, were they all grays?
Yes. They were all grays. In pretty much every incident, there was only once when I experienced a different kind of being, and it was a Sasquatch. And that incident is also in my book. So that one kind of happened by accident, because a friend of mine and we were on this hike in Short Hills, which is a big forest-like park in St. Catharines. And we were going up this hill. And when we got to the top of the hill, there was a ship sitting on the ground in front of us, and the door was open, and there were no beings around. We couldn't see any beings anywhere. And so I said, hey, look at that. I said, I've got to have a look inside. So I walked around to the hatch that was open, and I looked in the ship. I couldn't see any beings or any life in there whatsoever. So I went up the steps a little bit, and I looked around inside the ship, and I noticed there was a huge chair, a gigantic chair sitting there. It was the only piece of furniture in the ship, other than their medical equipment or whatever. And it seemed kind of out of place, this big, huge chair, and I wondered what it was for. So then I heard my friend outside yelling, "Come on, they're coming." And so I ran down the steps, and I looked, and there was at least 3, maybe 4 beings coming toward the ship, and they had seen us. And so we decided to make a run for it. And we ran down the side of the hill. It was like a crest. And we ran down into this field down below as fast as we could. And I just briefly glanced behind me, and I saw them lined up along the top of the bank, and they were pointing something at us. And I thought it was a gun or something like that. So I started to zigzag because a moving target is harder to hit. And but it didn't do any good because it was some kind of a laser device with a beam, and a beam isn't like a projectile. You know, when you it doesn't matter if you zigzag, they're going to hit you with it at some point. And that's what happened. They hit my friend and I in the back as we were running, and we both fell on the ground, and we were paralyzed. We couldn't move. And I could hear this crunching sound like branches breaking or something, and something was coming toward us. And I wasn't sure what it was, and I could just hear this crunching. And then I looked, and there was this big hairy foot standing on the ground next to me. And I could move a little bit at that time, and I could see that it was a Sasquatch or a Bigfoot, you know. And I was shocked. And it reached down and it picked me up in one arm and my friend up in the other. And this guy was really big. And he walked back up the bank carrying us. And we couldn't struggle to get away because we couldn't move. We were like temporarily paralyzed. And when we got up to the top of the hill, the beings took us both inside the ship. And this big Sasquatch came up inside the ship, and he went over and sat down in this big, huge chair. And so I realized what the big chair was for. And they had my friend on like a gurney type of arrangement, and they were looking at his head, and I could see it looked like there was blood coming out of his mouth. But he looked okay otherwise. And they took me and they sat me down across from this Sasquatch on a bench. And I couldn't take my eyes off it. I was absolutely astounded by the enormity of this big hairy creature. And he was frightening me more than the aliens were frightening me. I wasn't afraid of them, but I was afraid of him because I didn't know if he was going to attack me or he wasn't moving. So,
and they were grays, correct? Just the typical grays.
Yeah. So I was just staring at this being, at this Sasquatch. I couldn't take my eyes off him. And finally, one of the grays came over to me and he said, "Stop staring at him. You're making him nervous." And I felt that was kind of funny, actually. So I looked away from him. I tried to look at the floor. I tried not to look at him. But every now and then I'd lift my head up and sneak a peek at him again. And I just wasn't comfortable with him sitting there that close to me. And I guess they don't like people, Sasquatches.
Did he have any kind of smell or anything like that about him? Any kind of odor?
I've been trying to remember that, and I can't remember any smell, but that doesn't mean that he didn't have one. You know, it just means I couldn't remember. I've never had that particular incident investigated under hypnosis. That I remembered consciously. What I have remembered of it. I'd like to go under another session sometime and recall the whole incident.
Okay, well, what we'd like to do is recommend your book on Amazon to everyone out there watching online and in the chat room. Sounds like a very good book. It tells his story probably in the same detail he told us tonight, if not more so. So check it out. Tommy?
Absolutely. Steve, we really appreciate you being here with us this evening. A wonderful story. You tell it very, very well. Again, just going back to Tim's point, everybody, that's his book. Definitely go out there and check that out. All kinds of great stuff in there. Again, this man he's told a story that, I mean, there could have been hundreds of examples out there of the shows and everything that he's been on with his story. So this is kind of a well-known thing. Fantastic book, I'm sure. So go out there and check that out, folks.
Right. And
Yeah.
Steve, I want to thank you for being on here as well. We really appreciated your time and your effort that you put into telling us the story in detail.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me. I haven't done an interview for quite a while now, and it's nice to be able to tell people again.
Sure. You haven't lost a step, sir.
Right.
Yeah.
We thank you very much. And Tommy, any last words?
Just want to thank everybody for coming out as always. And by the way, folks, we have something new coming out. This is by popular request. Tim and I are actually going to do basically just a podcast one-on-one show on Thursday evenings. There we go. It's the new UFO Men show. It's going to run about an hour. We're going to do some videos. We're going to talk about UFO topics, even sneak into the paranormal. Never can really tell. The thing about it is, I mean, we've been very fortunate. We have so many interviews that are basically booked into the summer that we felt that we had to add another show to be able to showcase the UFO videos and things of that nature. So that's kind of our goal here. So check us out Thursday nights 10. The time is
9 p.m. Eastern, and same as Saturday. So we'll still be doing Saturday's live show at 9 p.m. Eastern as well. We're just adding a show, and the one on Thursday will only be an hour long. And we're also going to include UFO news of the day, breaking advancements in astronomy, aerospace industry, etc. So if you want to come and visit us during that stream, that show, you're more than welcome. So to everyone in the chat room who participated this evening, to all of our subscribed members, including the 2 new members that joined this evening, that I will add to the list for next week. We want to thank these people: Donna McFadden, Beats, Occam's Razor, Victor Morales, Lisa Smaltz, John Vierson, Mick Hansen, Tom Stryker, Robert Smith, Jenny Starr, Victoria Eggerts, April Schlentz, Trevor Nickerson, Peter Brace, Philip Glennis, Kevin Ships, Jennifer Adamek, who is not on the list, Alex or Mr. D.B. Cooper joined this evening, and another gentleman joined who I will also add to the list for next week. Thank you very much for joining the channel. And thank you to Black Lotus Productions, Thomas Fessler, and Nanine for the super chats. We really appreciate it. I hope you all can come back next Saturday for the live stream. And I also hope you can also check out Steve Boucher at his website. If I remember correctly,
www.experiencer.ca.
Right. Go out and check him out at his website. Check out all his material. Listen to his music. Check out his artwork. Very talented man. So thank you for watching. And I hope to see you next Thursday.
Yeah.
And good night.